So 5 or 6 years ago, we decided that we wanted to start incorporating some sourdough and some ancient or traditional grains into our diet. And so once we kind of decided that, then it led us down the rabbit trail of grinding our own grains and having some sort of mill to grind our own grains. And so we get a lot of questions about milling our own grains, and so we are going to share the grain mill we ended up purchasing and what our experience has been with it. So prior to incorporating some sourdough and some ancient grains into our diet, we were eating a primarily grain-free diet. Actually, we had kind of started this health journey that led us down this grain-free path, and so we had really been avoiding grains for several years, but then we decided we wanted to start incorporating some things like nutrient-dense sourdough and ancient grains like einkorn into our family's diet. And so that is when we decided if we are going to incorporate these grains, we want to do it in the best way possible, so we should get a grain mill. We knew nothing about them, we didn't know anyone else who had them, and so we just started Googling.
Yeah, so why might somebody even want to buy a grain mill in the first place? It's certainly more convenient just to buy pre-ground flour and have that readily available to use anytime you want on hand. So as we were thinking about different types of grains and what we wanted to grind, obviously there's nutritional value in them that we wanted to preserve, and so that was a big part of why we wanted to have something that we can mill our own grains with at home and turn them into flour. And so grains, when they're in kind of their whole form, like a kernel or like a wheat berry, that's when they preserve the best. And they're kind of dry, whole form, they'll last for years, and they'll preserve their nutritional value for years in that whole form. And so when you break them down and grind them or mill them, they don't have that same shelf life then, and they lose some nutritional value over time. Really, that was the most compelling thing for us of why we would want to have a home grain mill, was to have that freshness on hand so that we could grind fresh flours whenever we needed to, or fresh corn meals, things like that, whenever we needed to.
Because really, once a grain is ground into flour, to keep it and preserve it, to keep it fresh, it should be stored in a fridge or in a freezer. And we were like, well, if we're going to be buying, 10, 15, 20, 50-pound bags of flour, we don't have that much space to store all that in our refrigerator or in our freezer. But it's much easier to take 5-gallon buckets and store your grains, and then just grind what you need and maybe store a few cups of flour in your fridge. And so that's what we've done, and it's worked out really, really well. I wouldn't call us like preppers or survivalists. So grains are one of the foods that we buy in bulk. We buy a year's supply at the beginning of the year, maybe even a couple years supply, because it stores really, really well. Or we grow a ton of dent corn, and we have like a 10-year supply of dent corn in our basement. But at any time, we can take that and we can grind it into cornmeal. And so there is some peace of mind there. If anything were to ever happen, we have our grain mill that we can then turn these grains into flour at any point.
Yeah, and it's just a lot better value too. Like if you look at the prices of kind of just buying wheat berries in their whole form,
especially
versus in bulk versus buying the same quantity in already milled flour, it's like almost double or maybe even more than double the cost to have it go through that process beforehand. And so you can really save a lot of money, it's a good value, and then like we said, just have that kind of supply ready to go on hand whenever you need it.
Yeah, and then you have the freshest option there is. And so what did we end up going with? So when we were looking for a mill, we started where we always start. We were looking to find a used mill. So we were looking on Craigslist at the time to see if there was anything out there, and we were just striking out. We weren't finding anything within a fairly large radius around us.
I searched pretty hard and there was nothing.
that we could find. But maybe now you might be able to find more, because I think they're more and more popular. So there might be something available used now, but 5 or 6 years ago, we were not able to find anything used. And so we kind of realized, okay, if we want to do this, we are going to have to invest in something. And so that is where we began to have the conversation of, do we go electric or do we go hand mill? And so at the time, it was just Jim and I. We had one baby who was tiny and really not even eating yet. We were just really cooking for two. We were just starting out with sourdough. We're like, we don't really need that much. And we are just generally kind of old-fashioned anyway, and just really drawn to the idea of hand grinding our own grains. And so that is the route that we went.
Yeah. So ultimately we ended up purchasing the WonderMill Junior Deluxe, and we really loved it. It's been a great fit. It just clamps onto your countertop, so you could pretty much install it anywhere. It's small, it's compact. One of the big draws for us was that in addition to like the stone burr mills that it has for grinding like dry grains, it also has some like metal grinding wheels or discs for grinding wet things. Like you could turn like nuts into nut butter, and I can never remember the name of it.
Yeah, you can nixtamalize corn to make masa, to make like corn tortillas.
Yeah, so there's a lot of options with it, and all of it like comes in the package. Like you don't have to buy any of these things separately. It just kind of all comes together. You get the different options right there. That was like, when we were looking at the time, really good value, bang for your buck. There are a lot more like high-end like hand crank ones out there. Generally, most of those have a flywheel attached, which makes the grinding process a lot easier, because that creates momentum and just it's easier to hand crank it that way. This one does not have that. It's very bare bones. So you are going to get like a good workout from this thing. It's like you don't have to go to the gym that day if you're grinding wheat for like a half hour or hour or whatever. It's a good workout for you. But yeah, it's totally been worth it for us, and we've loved having it.
Yeah, I think another thing that we do like about this specific one is that it is just on our countertop all the time, and it's pretty. Like, it's not huge. It doesn't take up a ton of space. It looks kind of fun. It adds some character to your kitchen, and it's a huge conversation piece, right? Like every time anyone comes over, they're like, "What is this?" Everyone gives it a crank, and it's like, "What's going on here?" And so it's a fun way to teach people. And not only do our kids kind of only know this is where grains and flour comes from. This is what it looks like in its original form. This is what it looks like once it's ground. But other people that come into our home also see that process just because it's out on our countertop.
Yeah, and we've really only found more and more uses for it as we've gone. Like, we started with just the wheat berries and grinding those into flour. But since then, like, we started growing our own dent corn, like we mentioned, and having, the dried kernels. And then we started grinding cornmeal with it, which has been awesome. And we've used the cornmeal a lot since having it as well.
I should note that electric mills will only do the dry grain. So most especially the standard electric mills only do dry grain. So you can't do the wet stuff with an electric mill.
Yeah, so the WonderMill Junior Deluxe, or really any hand mill that you use at home, is kind of like it's slow food at its finest, right? It's an awesome connection to kind of this slow food heritage where 100+ years ago, our ancestors for generations were grinding their own grains on a stone wheel, basically. And in some ways, it's pretty cool that every time we grind wheat here at home, we're like connected to that heritage of grinding our own grains in this really slow, traditional way. And it's just a really cool connection to your food as well.
Yeah, so there's definitely nothing fast or convenient about it, but it's neat, right? But I would say, as our family has grown, so instead of having one tiny baby, we now have 3 not so babies, kids that like to eat a lot. And so as our family has grown and as we've had to grind more and more wheat, I often ask Jim, like, do you think now is the time to get an electric mill? Because it does take a considerable amount of time to grind when we are grinding like 15 or 20 cups of wheat to make, like 3 or 4 pizza crusts and a couple loaves of bread and all the things that we like to make in a month. And so as our family grows, I do think an electric mill will be in the future for us here at some point. But we haven't quite pulled the trigger yet. So if you are into grinding your own grains, if you have an electric mill that you love, tell us below in the comments. We'd love to hear from you because it might be one of our next purchases. But that has been our experience grinding our own grains. We really, really do love it. We really have found the value in it and just see the difference in terms of the quality, the nutrition, and just the benefits of being able to store those grains, buy them in bulk, and always have them on hand. Yeah, so if you're interested in hearing more about kind of how we do sourdough, what our We do actually a once a month sourdough routine, so we usually grind all of our wheat and our grains at one time. We do one humongous batch sourdough session, and so if you want to learn about that, we'll link to a video where we share all the details about it next. So we'll see you over in that one.